April underway here. Welcome to the meeting. Rather than dive through the entire roll call, we'll just we have 3 items for the agenda today. If you have the agenda in front of you. Before we dive into that though, do we have any public input from anyone in attendance, digitally or in person?
Yeah, and Brooke, Karna, and Sarah, I see you all as attendees. You can raise your hand if you want to make any public comment. I'm not seeing any.
All right. Well, I did get to watch most of the meeting from April 3rd and reviewed the minutes. They look good to me. Does anybody have any comments before I entertain a motion to approve the April 3rd meeting minutes? All right, does anybody want to make a motion?
So moved.
All right, I'll second. All in favor of approving the April 3rd meeting minutes as distributed, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you, everyone. Let's jump right into the new chair and potentially vice chair election. I think you touched on this on April 3rd. I don't know if we have an official nomination or where that stands, Ben.
Yeah, so we don't have an official nomination. One BDAB member has expressed an interest. We're also, recruitment is open right now for 3 new seats, or 3 open seats, I should say. We're not adding seats. So Kevin, Travis, and Keith are all terming off. So if the interested person wished to be nominated as chair, we could hold a vice chair election once those new folks are appointed to BDAB over the summer, I think in June.
All right, so most importantly then, let's tackle the chair position. So I nominate Brianna, and we've already had a discussion, and I wanted to hear, Brianna, if you accept that nomination or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, based on our conversation, if everybody's in favor of that, I am good taking on that role going forward based on what we discussed and just sort of the support from Ben and learning my way through it.
I'll second.
Well, your support of BDAB, of meetings outside of BDAB, and kind of being a liaison to several groups, including homelessness and other key city council objectives, and that's proven your dedication. I'm thrilled with you taking the chair position. Does anybody else want to open the conversation up to others before we entertain a vote? All right. So Ben, I should ask on protocol, is it a motion or is it an actual vote? What do you think?
You had the motion and then Kevin seconded. So I think you can have a vote. Oh, Keith just jumped on too.
Hey, Keith, thanks for joining us.
Will this appointment be after Travis finishes his term, or are we going to do it prior to his departure?
After this meeting is typically when we after the meeting where the vote is held. So we won't put Brianna on the spot and make her run the rest of the meeting right now, but you'll officially be chair after the meeting, and then you can introduce yourself as the chair when you and Gary talk at the council meeting on Wednesday for the council update. So no pin or anything or a hat.
A badge.
Right. Add it to my
Part of your 37 pieces of flair.
Right.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and vote. All in favor of having Brianna be the chair of BDAB for the next year, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Another unanimous vote. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brianna, for stepping up.
Thank you.
Yes, agreed. All right, item number 4, the permitting fees discussion. So I think this group kind of had the conversation cut short 2 weeks ago. And Ben, do you want to get us up to maybe where we were and frame the discussion moving forward?
Yeah, like I said, I think everyone here has seen the presentation at least once and probably multiple times, different forums at this point. Really wanted to use this time as an opportunity for one, for you to all ask questions. So Russ Grayson, Colin Stevens, and Teresa Briggs are here from the city to answer any questions. I invited Jeanette, our finance director, as well, and she may come down at some point. So she accepted the meeting and can maybe answer any questions about the broader budget, city budget as well. But given that you had the presentation, not a whole lot of time for deliberation, certainly have the option today to one, get answers to any questions. And I think Colin can bring up the slides if we want to get into that. And then other than that, maybe try to kind of bring this conversation in a little bit for a landing around what you'd like BDAB's feedback to be to council and or staff. I mentioned this to Travis, the budget discussions are actually in the end of May, but there is a council check-in on Wednesday that Gary and Brianna will be at, where permitting will be a topic, not necessarily the budget, but if you want to share feedback with council, we could turn it around in terms of a letter before that Wednesday meeting as well. And that would require a vote. And I mentioned this earlier, but we'll have to make sure we do that before we get to a vote. We will do the potential conflict of interest, kind of raise your hand and share, just because this is a topic that does interact with a lot of your livelihoods, right, as well. So no direct conflicts of interest from what I've heard from legal, but potential conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, obviously work on permits. I don't pay the permits or establish them, but so I can't think of how.
Yeah,
And
and
I don't have any of my own.
Yeah, and we'll just do it before the motion, just so everyone's clear. And we haven't had legal in a while. If you are in an industry that may be impacted by any vote on a council appointed board or council that's, or if you're on council, just raising your hand and saying, I have a potential conflict of interest, it sort of shields you essentially by getting that out in the open. Direct conflicts of interest would be if we were talking about policy that would make Mid-Oregon Credit Union illegal in Bend, Kevin, or something like that. That would be a direct conflict of interest, right? And no policy is forthcoming, which is why I used that as an example. So you've got direct conflicts that really impact you personally, financially, and these are more indirect potential conflicts. So just before we get to a motion, I just don't want to forget that.
Do you want to just do that now?
Yeah, I think it couldn't hurt before we have the conversation. So just, we can go around if you, just say I have a potential conflict of interest, what the reason for it, and we'll just get that out of the way. And Gina will get it in the minutes.
I have a potential conflict of interest in that my employer has a large project pending application subject to those fees in the next 30 days.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. Anyone else?
I'll claim a potential conflict of interest just based on my involvement with COBA.
Excuse me, could Gary speak up? We can't hear him.
I have a potential conflict of interest as well for involvement in, the development community as well as my role in COBA.
And I would also probably have a potential just with Pinnacle Architecture, my employer, which I'm an owner of, but future markets being affected or the potential decline in activity, but nothing that should be affected in the short term, I guess.
Perfect. Anyone on the call impacted by that? And to be clear, not a bad thing. I mean, council appoints folks in industries that are impacted by all sorts of decisions because those folks have expertise in those areas, right? So this is more a formality just to make sure that it's very clear if anyone watches this conversation later. Yeah, so I hopefully that teed it up. I think, like I said, first and foremost, kind of questions that you all have after hearing the presentation, feedback, things you'd like to see. Travis, you mentioned you got to watch the recording. Tierney, hopefully you got to catch the permitting discussion as well. So I think we're all kind of up to speed on where everything's at this point. But didn't want to have another presentation at this point. It's really more for conversation.
When does it go to council?
It will go to the budget committee on the 22nd and 23rd, but the fees and the budget will be adopted, I want to say mid-June, is that right, Teresa? June 21st. Yes. adopted.
This is a question for Colin and possibly for Russ. So I'm having a hard time reconciling the math in my head. So since beginning of 2021, the inflation rate's been 15%. So if you throw on another few percent for 2020 inflation, the most you're going to get to is 20%. Yet we have 100% increase in our fees over the next few years. Have you guys done any additional work on why there's such a disparity between, you know, the rising costs in the world and how short we are in the various departments that you oversee?
Yeah, I think really what it comes down to is we didn't take increases in years where we should have. So the CPI, we should have probably taken about a 3% CPI every single year. There were 3% in 2020 and 3% in 2022, but that was it. And so we were kind of in a hole, so to speak, which is compounding, but we didn't realize that because we were eating through reserves, and that helped us to not have to increase the fees just to follow CPI. I think if we had, and there was that slide in the presentation for the Western region where it's close to 20% since 2018 when we had it in there. If we had just taken that rate every single year, regardless of what our reserves were, we wouldn't be having the same conversation now. We're maybe taking a little bit of a higher one, just based on some of the contracts that we recently went into effect that caused our personnel costs to go up. But we wouldn't be having, 30, 40, 50, 60% increase discussions.
Yeah, I think you're just to add a couple things. You're in the kind of this perfect confluence of a lot of events happening. One, the revenue forecast right now is flat year on year in terms of what projects are coming in, because we're being extremely conservative on what the crystal ball looks like with the economy right now, and that could change over time. We get a couple big buildings and these, especially in the building department, that changes the story quite significantly quickly. Also remember, we weren't fully staffed. So when you look back, you're looking at actual cost, not what our full staff count was. And we've been chasing our tail on that for years, trying to get that up. If we would have been fully staffed, you would have, review times probably would have been increased, which is what everybody wants. But also our staff has been working extremely hard, feeling like they can't take vacations or can't take time off. It's been very stressful for them. So we haven't been fully staffed, and now we're at fully staffed. If we were staffed back then, we probably would have seen the need for fee increases back then. It would have been extremely hard for us to come forward with fee increases at the time if we were sitting on 24 months of reserves, right? So I want to make sure we put that in context. And then with the rising increases of personnel and operational costs and overhead costs, compounded with we're now fully staffed, compounded with a flat revenue forecast, that's where the budget documents came in at when you start looking at everything. What we want to do is we do need to make a structural change to the fees with you call a significant fee increase now. But what we're willing to do as well is we want to watch what our revenue is doing and what the market's going to do over the next 6 months. We can look at quarter on quarter to see what happens. But we know that we've got a structural problem we need to fix. We're not saying we need to go all the way up to the 40, 50, 60% range, but we do need to see some significant increase now. And then what we want to do is lay out a plan going forward of how do we look at all these different factors. I know it looks I can understand the confusion in terms of when you're looking at the data points, like how does it just fall off the cliff so fast? But it's a culmination of multiple factors coming into the budget. And I do also want to say review times are coming down. We're fully staffed. We're on that curve to where everybody wants us to be. And so we want to make sure that we can maintain that curve and make sure that our staff is here to be able to actually review things on the designated timelines that everybody wants. And we're getting closer and closer to that. So we don't want to lose that momentum either.
So what I'm hearing, Russ, is, from the presentations I've heard, the short term is an absolute need, and whether those numbers end up being 10 or 20 or 30%, depending on division, there may be some wiggle room in there, but it certainly isn't a lot of wiggle room. That's the year one immediate fee increase. But the 3 to 4 year projection that it shows, 70% increases over time. That's where maybe we bring in, Russ, you're bringing up some check-ins and accountability so that we don't just let this continue to march along that path unchecked. Does that sound right?
That's really what we want to look at. It's like, where are the markers that we want to be able to be? And as you can tell, we're trying to be completely transparent with our situation. We're not trying to hide anything. We're trying to be as open as we can and candid as we can. And I think BDAB is kind of that perfect kind of committee for us to be checking in with on this. So we can come back, give you quarterly updates on revenue and expenditures, get the feel on what's going on with the market, what we're seeing on the market, and then just address it, on this quarterly basis as we go through. And the out years, really, that's more of a budgetary exercise to make sure that we're clearing our hurdles of our fiscal policies. But I think there's a middle ground in here where we can kind of do something now, and then let's monitor this as this goes through. And it's gonna be quite transparent if we're above the line or below the line, and also looking at market conditions as well. Is the market changing? Are we seeing a recession? Are we not? Are we seeing we're actually moving pretty fast out of this, which will have an impact on what our revenue source is going to be. It's one of those things. It's really, we kind of run like a business, but it's really hard to run a business when you don't have control of the inputs that are coming into your business. That's kind of the environment we're in. And that's why reserves are important for us as well.
Yeah, that was one thing in our developers. I think the first time this presentation was given was to a small group of developers, and I was invited to join. I think that the one takeaway I came out of there was our future projections at fully staffed capacity. It just seemed like putting a lot of bodies in the department that if we had to scale back wouldn't be very flexible downward, right? You're adding to the massive expense, and that isn't going to go down anytime soon. So what thoughts do you have on kind of scalability upward that would, to me it's outsourcing, but there's probably some other options there too.
Yeah, Colin, do you want to talk about third-party review a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we are keeping the FTE and the permit review side of the house on all three funds the same. We're not asking for any additional staffers. We do, as it's on the slides, the years that we've closed out, we just put an actual number of FTE, not approved, because you can do the math and just see, because when people retire or leave, it usually takes us about 6 months or so to advertise and get somebody back on. So we're never really fully staffed, but we're not adding anybody. So we'll probably come in probably 5-8% below that full FTE, just based on past experience. We do have third-party review, which is part of our M&S, that is sort of a relief valve, and that's scalable. We can add money to that contract if we need to. We don't have to use that contract if we're not seeing activity levels. So that is one thing that we can sort of scale up and down for activities.
And what's plugged in there is like using them for a certain percentage of the time or something.
It's fairly discretionary. Before the meeting started, we were talking about a very large apartment complex that we now have under review, and it has some affordable housing units in it, so we had to move that to the front of the line. So we're using our third-party review on that one right now. Okay. So it's actually really good because we should have that closed out by the end of the fiscal year, so we'll have a good understanding about the cost benefit of using that third-party review.
But as far as the budget, like the number that was plugged in for the third-party reviews, I'm assuming based on everything else, it's on a conservative side, like using them more than not.
I think we've got.
Okay.
Where'd you hear that? Okay.
Sorry,
Oh.
Travis,
Say it on the,
Travis,
Yeah, Katie.
sorry to interrupt. I can barely hear Colin. If you could just, eat the mic. Thanks. Thank you.
So we're carrying forward what we're anticipating to spend this year into the next year for our third-party review.
And I think we understand the impact this has on businesses, on projects. We don't take this stuff lightly. The one thing we will say is, when you look at it, we've been understaffed And that's what's been saving us in terms of our budget. I think we were like 35, 36 over the past several years. We wanted to be at 44. The staffing levels that we are trying to achieve, I kind of match what we're trying to do in terms of review timelines and meeting the community expectations. So that's a big story of the budget of just, we haven't been fully staffed. So we've realized all these savings. We didn't feel it was appropriate to take budget adjustments at that time. Looking back, you could have a armchair quarterback discussion on that. But again, I felt it was kind of inappropriate to say, hey, we were sitting on 24 months of reserves. Let's ask for a 10% fee increase.
35, 36 to 44, just building, right?
Just
the
building.
division.
Yeah.
Current staffing levels are as was depicted in the presentation.
Jim's question was current staffing levels are what was predicted in the presentation.
Yes, so for fiscal year 24 and 25, in the presentation, there's a number on each of those bars, those vertical bars, that represents the number of FTE that are in the budget document. So if they are approved, those will be the number of approved FTE on July 1.
How many, so how does that compare to current staffing levels? Like if the budget is 44 for 23, 24, is that how many people are currently in the department?
Yes, we're not adding, well, there's one FTE, but it's not going into the review staff. So none of those bars would reflect that change.
Okay. And then just reflecting on the presentation I've seen a couple times now, one of the things that stood out to me was the amount in terms of looking at the overall budget, the increase, the amount of the biggest component seemed to be coming in overhead, both department overhead and citywide overhead. And so a question is, are there any changes in the method of allocation of costs to the department? When you look forward compared to historical numbers?
You know, that the cost allocation we do for, well, there's two things. We've got the citywide overhead, right, which is me and our city attorney's office, HR, our procurement group. Those allocations are pretty much the same structure that we've had for a long time. And we get audited every year. It's a sound structure. Costs have gone up, and personnel cost, and also what we've been asked to do as a city. The other thing to remember is we do not get any general fund subsidy as well, because of the kind of the structural problems we have with our tax rate here. So that's all, it's a standard practice, but yes, costs have gone up, and allocations have gone up.
We did a slight reallocation of the department overhead just between the building planning and engineering funds to base it on the number of FTEs. It's basically building is about twice as big as the other two. So they carry 50%. And then planning is 25 and engineering is 25%.
And then have we realized whatever efficiencies are expected to be gained from the new system? Was it CityView? Is that the name of it? And if not, when do we expect those efficiencies to be realized?
So we are starting to see the efficiencies from it. Over the past couple of years, it's been a struggle. I think we're not trying to hide that fact.
Right.
We have made some significant upgrades to the system. And that's one thing Colin's going to be talking about when he goes to council on Wednesday. It's just kind of what's going on in the review timeline and the permitting process. It's becoming less and less of the story or the headline around why it's taking longer to get stuff out. We still have things that we can improve. There's probably some additional steps in there that we can pull out to make the process easier. But from my perspective, the worst thing you could do right now is try to change horses and say, let's go put a new software out there. In terms of the amount of time it's going to take, the effort, the complexity, the confusion it's going to cause, taking staff offline. Also remember during this time, we had to take staff offline to get the software running and processed and developed and everything else. So all that has now been flushed through. We're fully staffed. I would also say from an administrative standpoint, if things get busier, we're adding direct plans examiners and inspectors. We've got the right structure in terms of administrative overhead, especially in the department, to manage growth as we need it moving forward as well.
And another point I will add on to for CityView is the reporting that we're able to do with CityView is very advanced. I'll be giving a presentation at the quarterly update on Wednesday to council, and the data that's in that is data that we couldn't pull out under our old system, and most jurisdictions aren't able to look that deeply into like how long was it with the city, how long was it with the applicant. There's a wide variety of things that we can really drill down in that show us what's happening with these review times, and that gives us tools in the toolbox to say, oh, here's a trend that we're seeing that maybe we could work on over here, where I think a lot of other types of software are a bit more of a black box. So I think it is helpful for us to develop efficiencies.
So we've been asked, why don't we just go to the state program, Acela? We actually reached out to Acela and the state when we were doing our process. The system wasn't robust enough for what we needed to do. Also remember, like everything that we've been asked to do from the state around early action programs, the initiatives that we have around SDC deferral programs, all that is possible for us to do because of the software. It has the flexibility for us to implement these systems into the software. I know it's been really hard for everybody to get through this, but we're kind of at a stabilization point where now we can get in that normal continuous improvement loop. And that's why we have dedicated staff, because we see some runway there, but it is improving.
Thank you.
When was City View started again? It's been 3 years, 4 years?
We launched it right when COVID was started, which was,
I thought it was
December, January of 20, I think is when was
of 20, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we
That
sent
was
sent everybody home 2 months later.
We all have we all have a significant hangover from the launch of City View. In terms of, and it's, when you look at all, I mean, a lot of the software launch that we've had, you run into these things. There were some special circumstances with City View that really caused some problems.
Ask a clarifying question. It's for Ben and Travis. So what are possible actions here would be like, to be supportive of this, to be opposed to it, to ask council to allocate general fund dollars to offset some of it? What's our range of options here?
I mean, yeah, I know it's tough because your range of options are essentially unlimited. I mean, BDAP gives fairly nuanced feedback all the time, right? I mean, you could say, hey, we begrudgingly approve of these, changes, but we want to keep an eye on them going forward. Also, council consider X, Y, and Z, right? It could be general fund support, or your letter can be more just based on council. We think you should understand that any increase in development fees has an impact during a pretty constrained time for development, right? And we can build some data around that based on what you've all seen. And typically when we write a letter for BDAB, try to get a vote from the board on maybe 3 or 4 principles with an overarching theme. And then I work on a letter with the chair that ends up submitted. So
And we could stay silent as well.
you can always stay silent unless council says we really want you to weigh in, which has happened, I think, a couple of times in the past. I think they'll have some feedback from other organizations as well. You may say we have no feedback on the actual validity of the changes or the scale, but you could say we'd like to see this sort of process happen this way in the future as well.
So I think we've talked a little bit about this previously, but total fee increase. It'd just be good to see a kind of a summarized, consolidated list of everything that we're looking at. I know we've talked about it, but my head sort of spins with all the numbers and charts that we've been looking at. The other thing, I don't think we need to, go back in history at all, but when you have things like the home energy score, DEI managers, those types of things that may not have been anticipated. What is the contingency for that moving forward? So through the next year, if there's something else to implement that was unanticipated. Go ahead.
No, that's a great question. And that's every question that we ask. Just, as policy is getting developed, like, okay, then if you want to do this, this is the staffing it's going to take and where's the funding coming from? It goes to this, a lot of the storyline here is just around everything that the city's being asked to do from the community and the extreme limited funding that we have, the structural problem with it. When you look at, we're talking about a transportation fee. We're always going out. We went out for a big geo bond. We've got this fee increase going on. But that is just, it is the structural problem of the city with the second lowest tax rate in the state and one of the fastest growing cities in the country, right? you're always gonna have this mismatch of what we're being asked to do in our budgeting. But I think it is a completely fair question, and we have to go by what the policymakers kind of want to do and where that responsibility lands in terms of budgets and fees and what they cover.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to Kevin's question a little bit too. And I was talking to someone over the weekend about this, where I think BDAB's feedback on the home energy score was don't add one, right? Or at least make it voluntary. The budgetary impact on permitting, right? Or other operational departments, is that something should have highlighted and said, council, if you do this, attach a fee to it and make sure it has its own dedicated revenue source. I don't know if that was a missed opportunity. That was kind of what the conversation was about. But
Isn't an AGS on a sale of an existing home?
Yes.
So how would that affect the department?
Well, it goes into basically into the department overhead, and then that gets cost allocated out.
yeah, there's been some discussions, I think at AHAC or the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, I think it came up, right? Or around, there's, I think, 0.5 FTEs associated with
program.
kind of overseeing the program.
But I mean, there are certain things that are just, they're the department overhead, running the front counter from 8 to 5 every day, right? That got more, we opened the hours of that to allow more. That's an extra FTE because you have to go from 2 to 3 people at that point to make sure that you've got enough coverage up there to run those. So that you have all those things, all the planning code updates that happen and all the policy things that occur, everything that's going on at the state level that we need to implement, all the data we now need to collect to be able to talk about our housing needs analysis and comply with all the reporting we have to do at the state level. That all has to be covered by a cost somewhere. And again, there's no general fund dollars coming in to cover that. So it is cost of doing business for the department.
Yeah, I think that's part of what Gary was saying is it's really hard to see. And I mean, I haven't been here for at least on this committee for a long time. I've been in the city of Bend for a long time, but it's hard to see some of those decisions and how they trickle out. Cause I mean, the decisions could have been very different if you were looking at them together and prioritizing what does the city, like, what is the responsibility of the city and what do we actually need in order to do have the things that the community wants and needs. And some of those may be more wants than needs. And now we're having a discussion that will affect any development in Bend. And that's going to have a bigger impact than some of these things that are, and I'm not saying that any of them are wrong or not with good intention, but just there's always a priority in how we make decisions and how those things get built in. And now when we're talking about, maybe it's not important that the counter is open to hire a whole nother person. Maybe it's that we need to communicate that you can come here between these hours and that's when those resources are needed. If you had a line out the door, that might be a different discussion. If it was just flexibility of when people wanted to drop in, then
I agree, but I also think even if you can say, okay, we're going to strike this and we're going to strike this, it's not going to change the conversation significantly, right? You're kind of dancing around the edges of the issue. The other thing to remind everybody is projects are becoming a lot more difficult, a lot more time intensive, and it just is taking longer to get things out the door, not because of the software, but just because of these are big projects. It's a different environment. We're working in a built environment now. We're not greenfield development. And all those cause projects, it takes more time for staff to go through it.
And I think the reason that I elaborated on that is more of that we should go into things with more eyes wide open, because I understand that right now this is a problem of functionality and it has to happen because of past years. But how do we prevent that from being this big in the future? How do we take those the 24 months of reserves and dwindle it down to where we have to have this discussion and really don't have a choice of approving something? So all those other things, and as board members change and different things happen, and there isn't that clarity to how the city is run as an entire, over a decade, then we want to have that be really transparent so that we don't repeat history and put ourselves into a place where we can't make decisions. Because I don't really see this as something that we can say, no, don't do that. I see it as, let's not ever do it again.
Yeah, I also think if we can get, again, some runway, for me, what I'd be looking for, if you want a suggestion, would be, we begrudgingly agree of we need 15 to 20% or whatever it is now. And then let's then going forward, we're not saying we're in support of all that, but let's monitor it. And we're looking for these these are our marker points, and we can come up with those of whether they're reserve levels or revenue expenditures out of whack. And we have something to baseline off of to right side. Because I think we've got a lot of assumptions and a lot of, we're not quite sure what the market's going to do built into this budget. So we'd really like that to kind of pan out over the next 6 months. Hopefully we get some stabilization in the economy and we really know what's going on.
Yeah.
This
And I-
exactly reflects the priorities of council, right? It's climate change, DEI, and pass the cost on to business. That is the priorities of council. And so that could be in our comment letter, that this action reflects the priorities of council.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you look at it a couple of different ways, right? When there's no money, there's no money. Right? I mean, that's the way business operates, right? So, and I guess my comments about contingency plans for future expenditures was more to that point that, everybody needs a contingency. I mean, we build it into our budgets. But if it's not there, that money comes out of reserves, right? So all of the work that you are doing today to try to get those reserves built back up can be quickly wiped out by a decision that city council makes. And, I guess looking at, back at past decisions that were made that ended up costing dollars, like just being conscious of that is important is all. So not that the decisions were wrong necessarily, but again, when we're talking about, a building owner comes to me and says, I want this building. And I say, fine, your budget matches this building. They come back to me a week later and say, I want this covered area behind the building. I say, no, your budget does not match that decision. So you don't get that.
And this, I mean, let's remember too, that that's an incremental part of this whole increase, right? Policy decisions. It's not the entire thing, but it certainly can be part of your feedback. I mean, any council policy is a reflection of council priorities, right? Well, for the most part, some of them are just kind of things they have to do, that the state tells them that they have to do.
I think the
There were
difference
a
is
few of
that when the money is gone here, you have a monopoly and you just go raise the price to what you need to fund your operations, which is a luxury that businesses don't have.
Yeah, and to Kevin's point on kind of these some of the unfunded mandates coming from the state and also the desires of the city council, the things they want to focus on. What other funding sources other than permits are being directed to fund those?
Well, I will give you a perfect example that is in relationship to what, our fees normally will be targeted towards or need to be used for. So the climate friendly rulemaking at the state, that is an unfunded mandate coming from the state. We are advocating at every possible angle we can, saying these are new rules that just got dropped. It is very impactful to the growth plan of the future of the city. We don't have the dollars to do all this stuff. When we've been trying to get grants and other funding sources, I don't know if we're going to be successful at that, but it is the law of the land right now. So we have to, our budget is built on, we have to comply with that. And we have to, and if there's not, we don't get a revenue source from somewhere else, we still have to do the work. So that, and we want to make sure that the city's prepared for a building permit or a planning application to come in and be successful. We need to make sure that all these things gel together.
And so like, are the permit fees funding 100% of that cost or
No.
some? Okay.
Well,
There is
permit
some
fees,
general
there's some general fund allocation that goes into our growth management group, but whatever that delta is, a lot of that is coming in from kind of the department overhead allocation that needs to occur. We do, that's why we're looking at the growth, we have a growth management fee that gets tagged onto permits as well. That's to help cover some of that cost. It's not full cost recovery for the department. I wish I had a better story, because if you look at other cities around the state, they do get some general fund allocations that come into them. We just don't.
And you can't change that.
Council can,
Council
but
can certainly.
but when you start having those discussions, you're up against, do we need more police officers? Do we need, versus do we want to put some general fund allocation? Do we want to look at houselessness and how we need to do and our housing programs? I mean, it's like, that's the policy discussions that council has. So it's a very difficult position to be in, and they're trying to juggle all the different needs and wants that are being requested from the community.
Katie, I saw your hand went up, but before that, Keith, your hand went up and then down. So I don't want to miss you.
Oh, yeah, well, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, from an accountant's point of view, I mean, the numbers are pretty, and we can argue about it all the time, but, the money's needed, we don't like it, but, I mean, I saw all the spreadsheets and everything. It was presented pretty closely. I mean, we're not the budget committee. I mean, we advise things, but, I don't know that it's our job to try to dig deeply into everything they spend their money on in the department. And we know it's funded by the permits, right? This is one place where you pay to play. All we've been doing for the last how many years is asking them to work harder and faster and have better turnaround times. And now we're complaining when they need more money. That's all I gotta say.
And Katie, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, and Keith, the other point is that a lot of folks have lost a lot of money as the city has been rectifying the situation. And I'm not meaning this to be to put more pressure, because I'm glad I am not Russ or Colin, because I think your job is hard. I get it that the money has to happen. I'm just wondering that during this phase in, can there be, and this is something that BDAB can recommend. It's a policy recommendation to the City of Bend Council. When you look at their goals, there's not one goal on there that really says we're supporting business. I think this and housing are the two biggest issues, the areas of policy development that they can work on to help support businesses. So a couple of things. Can we recommend to convene a work group that can look at creative solutions to other funding resources for operations and fix this thing for the long term, even if it hurts, even if it's hard? And number two is I really worry about the ability of builders to match the quota from the governor's office, and there will be repercussions if we don't. People are going to make different calculations now based on the increased costs of SDCs and the fees. And it doesn't, for me, looking at it, it doesn't look like it's something that encourages more building, it encourages less. So we're creating that problem. So the bottom line is there are a lot of pieces. This is very complicated and it costs a lot when you grow this fast and when you have a houseless problem. And I think that we have to get creative in looking at how we spread this out. Because if you put it directly on those responsible for developing the inventory that solves your problem, you're exacerbating it. And so I'm not saying stop from going forward. And I'm definitely not saying you don't need the money. I think this is a policy recommendation directly from the business sector to the city council saying, you need to incorporate the business needs into your goals. And here's what that looks like. We're willing to sit down with you and talk about creative and long-term ways of reconfiguring how we're paying for all this. If you either slow down or maybe we have to work in the context of your 3-year rolled out. But I think it needs to be done because this is not sustainable. And I do believe at the very heart of this, it's a policy decision. It's direction from the council and it's policies they're making around how we fund the growth of this city. And you need people to do that. There's no argument there. But how we're getting the money is a different issue.
Travis, I can punt it back to you. I was just trying to put traffic control on the comments. I will say that I've chatted with Russ and Colin and Counselor Perkins as well around BDAB, maybe providing some feedback, more saying we'd like to provide some consistent oversight, you know, checking in on this quarterly, kind of like Russ and Colin both alluded to, and everyone was on board with that to see how the picture's changing. But Katie had good feedback. You could work that in. Everyone had good feedback. Work it all in. It's up to you.
So generally what I'm hearing, and Brianna, I think you maybe said it most clearly, is in the short term, we need the money. And it's been the result of a can being kicked down the road for maybe the last 3 to 5 years. So year one, I think there's not a lot of opportunity in the next couple months to validate exactly what the numbers are. So there's got to be a lot of faith there. So my recommendation maybe is just to approve the year one increase and add guardrails. How can BDAB be a partner, to Katie's point, how can BDAB and the business community be a partner in future, I guess, funding brainstorming sessions? I think the answer, there's a lot of communities, peer communities in the state of Oregon that are solving this problem. If the ones that are solving it well are the ones with a much better tax base and they can just use general fund dollars, that doesn't help us, but we need to find other creative solutions. So I guess broadly, does anybody have any problems with the feedback of begrudgingly agreeing to the year one increase and maybe having quarterly check-ins?
I guess I'm sort of on the fence a little bit, but I do think there needs to be something to what Katie was saying about the recognition of what this might do to development. And that if it, like, what's that impact? And if it decreases the amount of development and we provide less affordable housing, then do they get to check that off one of their goals? But I agree with everything else she said.
Yeah, I just see this particular discussion as not having as many levers and dials as, let's say, the SDC discussion, which can be very nuanced around supporting housing. This is, unless the dollars come from the general fund, this just seems like it has to pay its own way.
There's like more complicated, bigger discussions around some creativity potentially, right? And I haven't been in these discussions long enough to, I'm sure they've been brought up before, but as an example, deferring fees to a later point in a project in development, right? Instead of pulling those fees in on the front end, if a project takes 2 years and you're pulling in all the infrastructure fees on the front end, does it make any sense to kick those down the road? And I'm just spitballing, but I just wonder, to more to Katie's point too, that maybe there's some creative solutions around, you know, if a developer's got that carrying cost for a couple of years to develop a project, maybe there's, you know, especially in a high interest rate environment like we're in now, then those become real dollars in a couple of years, right? So is there opportunity to look at some of these programs and figure out some maybe creative solutions? And I'm sure you've had this.
I would say yes, and you're probably going to see them soon around the SDC methodology. Right now, we have a multifamily SDC deferral program that basically says you can pay your SDCs at the time of permit all the way to the time where you have a CO. It is based, currently the current policy is based off of whatever the SDC rate is at the time of whenever you pay. We're having discussions right now in the SDC stakeholder group, which those recommendations will come back around to all these advisory boards as they start to coalesce. But we're asking the question now, in fact, we were talking about it last week, do we open that program up, because we can with the software, to allow that to other things besides just multifamily, whether it's commercial industrial or all single family. I mean, we're going from a handful of permits to, you know, we need to make sure we have it programmatically set, but we understand the interest carry on a construction loan for, you know, 12 months on a big project. That makes sense to us. And we're in a position now to be able to offer, I think, some assistance in that type of stuff.
Did you say you pay the rate as the rate applies at whatever time you make the payment?
That was the policy direction when we started this, when we talked to the last council around multifamily deferrals. They wanted to do that. Our recommendation would be, if you start to open this thing up, and from an administrative standpoint, we should just be locking in, you lock in your rate at the time of the permit issuance and you can pay anytime between now and then because it's a lot simpler on the administrative side that we don't have to track, 3 or 4 different fee schedules to figure out what you need to pay.
Right, and then the builder doesn't have to
And we had,
try to arbitrage between his interest cost.
and there was an
how fast
agreement
the
that
raise-
people had to sign and
SDCs are going.
I'd rather get rid of all that and simplify the process. But I want to let you know, I mean, those are the things that we look at all the time because we understand the impact of that.
Gary, to your point and to what Katie brought up earlier, I mean, BDAB can create subcommittees, temporary ones to look at things like potential other revenue sources or ways to, I mean, you'll hear some of it with the SDC methodology, but what other ways can reduce the burden as costs increase? And it's a process Katie went through on the citywide transportation advisory committee, if I'm remembering correctly, right, Katie, around.
You're gonna hear about the transportation fee as that develops and what that's now.
So that could be some of your feedback too, if you want to kind of say, hey, we want to do this work. Council, do you have any concerns?
Yeah, and can the recommendation also speak to the structural issue that you're referring to? I think with the fact that we've got the lowest, lowest property tax rate in the city and in the
Second lowest
state.
tax rate in the state. I think we're the lowest tax rate for comparable sized cities. To put it in scale, we've shown this before. If we had the same tax rate as Redmond, we'd have another $10 million about coming into the general fund. And that's starts to solve some questions there, doesn't it?
Yeah, because otherwise, the only place you can look to cover the cost of operating the city, which I recognize it's there, it has to be funded. But the only place you can go is the business community. And whereas if we address the structural issue, the tax rate, then it gets spread out.
We would be more than happy to engage in that conversation.
But I'm just, my question is, can the recommendation speak to that issue as, because that's it's a longer term.
It does make a lot more sense, though. I mean, I get the competition with the greater community needs, but in theory, those things should play fairly. You shouldn't have one part of the community take on the burden of the whole.
I mean, I'll give you, I always say system development charges. If we found another way to fund infrastructure, I'd be the first one at the table saying reduce SDCs, right? And that's because we understand the direct correlation of impact.
So is that statement about our property tax rate true when you account for how we handle parks compared to? other
There's some
municipalities?
nuances in there, but I mean, when you look at their tax rate and kind of where they allocate it towards, we try to do, and we can get you more information on this in apples to apples comparison, but it's in the millions of dollars, the differential.
Yeah.
And it's measures 5 and 50 that really blocked us in.
That we pay in parks, the difference, whereas
But we-
Redmond has
we-
parks as part of.
We
their
have a
city.
comparison of kind of across the board, apple to apple on that, if you want to see it.
It's more nuanced than that in that states were or cities were kind of locked in when those measures passed. So some cities had high rates, right? And of course, yeah, having parks separate has its own impact, right? But you compare us to Portland, I think just
Yeah.
our actual rate, the check you cut for all property taxes in Portland is significantly higher.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, in terms of capturing issues to comment on, it sounds like we would like to express concern about kind of the impact of this on the business community, particularly in conjunction with the other things that are happening. And if those impacts will be adverse to council's other goals, particularly around housing development, consistent with the governor's order. And then, perhaps suggest a way to address the structural issue with general fund dollars.
I think the concerns are absolutely appropriate to bring up in this letter, as is the need for kind of further discussion and oversight with the business community around solving the problem. Kevin, do you have a problem with the signing a letter from BDAB that would, acknowledge the short-term need and begrudgingly accept the short-term increases?
Well, yes and no. I don't think that's really our responsibility as the business advocacy group. I mean, the council and the budget committee know the cost of government, so we can opine on that if we're so inclined. But I think if I were going to add something, I would probably add, focus on efficiency of government, right? You still have this discrepancy between the growth rate in cost and the growth rate in inflation, and there's a divergence there that, you know, like, maybe that looks like continuing to work on realizing efficiencies from the software. I don't know, that will extend well beyond my term, thankfully, but
I think that's a valid point. Absolutely. It bears further scrutiny for sure. And I did not properly set up our timeline. Ben had mentioned in the email, we're trying to get this done in an hour, even though we had an hour and a half reserved. I do have a hard out here in just a minute. So anything we're missing to add to this?
And I have been taking notes, Travis. I mean, given the transition meeting,
I think Travis, oops, sorry.
Sorry,
Ben.
Uh,
I think just that I think anytime that you come out of the box saying, you know, this is a really tough thing for us to take. And especially if we're saying slow this down at all, or I think that the other offer here is that we want to step up and look at and work with council and see if there is other alternatives. I think it's important when you come out with something like this, that you're also willing to actually try and find a solution. And it also helps create some faith in the solution as well. So I think some sort of a committee and participation in that for other funding sources, and or just looking at how it's going with this increase in fees to supply feedback and really take a look at that and ground truth it would be advantageous to the business community to have our finger to the pulse and to help.
I agree with what you just said there, other than I don't know if we want to set up another committee. I kind of feel like BDAB might still be the right group to take that feedback on a quarterly basis.
Fair, that's fair.
Okay.
So I'm kind of trying to take notes here. Just in terms of bullet points, and there's a lot of nuance that we can build out around with the conversation, but these are the high level bullet points. You understand the need for the fee increase in year one. I won't use the word begrudgingly in the letter because but council should understand that has an impact on housing and development goals in Bend. There's the guardrails discussion. You'd like to provide some oversight as a board. You'd also like to look into alternative avenue or revenue sources, what those may look like and how those may be rolled out. And then some acknowledgement for council. There are structural issues in our tax rate. You understand they're balancing different community needs, but making those or trying to address community needs through via unfunded means is a concern for the business community. And then maybe a focus on how to increase efficiency of government. So try to break that into kind of 4 bullet points. That last one's a mouthful, but I'll turn it into a paragraph or something like that. And just wanted to give you all something to maybe make a motion around or edit.
one thing I would add is it's also, I think, worth noting the improvements that have occurred in the staffing levels and the turnaround times, and that's part of the reason for the cost of it. But that is an issue we've been talking about nearly as long as I've been on BDAB, and to see it, to see that problem being addressed is worth acknowledging as well. Yeah. So with that, I would make the motion as been described.
With your addition.
I second that motion. All in favor of drafting a letter for Ben and Kevin's comments, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right,
I was scratching my
motion
head.
passes. Thank you.
Don't scratch your head during motions. Good thing to remember.
There's never a scratcher. Yeah.
All right, I know I have to jump off. Ben, you had mentioned you had one more item on the agenda. Do you want to punt it or just talk about it briefly?
I'll just say I'm looking for a couple of volunteers to really run through the business advocacy budget in the next week or so. Probably do it via Zoom with an in-person option up in one of the conference rooms. that's publicly available, but anyone's interested, super simple budget. Teresa helps me with it every year anyway. But we do need to talk a little bit about business registration increases, largely tied to the EDCO contract, and we'll go into more detail here and then talk about it in May as well. But I wanted to have kind of a small group to vet it out. So if you're interested, let me know, and I'll send an email out today.
Yeah.
As well.
If you can push it past the 5th, I would be willing to do that.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate the second meeting of the month. I think we're adjourned. Everybody have a good day.
Thanks, Travis. Appreciate it.